Good morning, New Day Fellowship. Today, I want to have you put yourself as a witness. And because there was a trial, probably the trial of our lifetime, and I want you to become a witness to think about this. And we're going to use 4 different witness testimonies or accounts. We're going to use it from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to focus on the events around the crucifixion. We're going to back up a tiny little bit with the Garden of Gethsemane, but then we're going to, and that's where the arrest and everything happened. So we're really going to start there. We're not going to dig heavy into that. I first want to start, and we'll go back to this, but you have to think of the purpose of the people who are writing the 4 books and how they ended up kind of where they are. Matthew gets to go first because he was actually a disciple that was one of the 12, and so I think that historically they felt like that he definitely deserved to be first over these other 4. And he has more of a purpose of writing, making a connection. He makes the connection between Jesus being Jewish to being for everybody, for the Gentiles, for everybody. And so that's his kind of purpose and drive, is kind of talking about the theological connections with the Old Testament, and then his documents are then recorded in what we would call the New Testament. So he kind of makes that connection, and I think that's probably a good reason to say that he's first. Mark, his purpose is to tell us that Jesus is God, and he is more in story form. And then we have Luke. Luke is meticulous. He's a historian, and he puts a lot more detail in some things. And then if you get to the 4th one of John, it's quite different in that John is really talking more theology and maybe even more of in stuff than Mark about that Jesus is God. And so his is a different deal, and there are a lot more discussions in his book than in the previous 3. There are a lot more discussions with Jesus and the people that are conducting the arrests and everything. Well, we're going to start back with Matthew 26:39. We'll go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew 26:39, it says, oh wait, I went too far. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead with this one, and let's back up. I need to back up even further. I think I put the wrong 20. Okay, here it is. 25:39, not 26:30. No, it was 26:39. I was right in the first place. Okay, and it says, this is talking about Jesus. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and praying, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." So I think that, if we're a witness, we got a court reporter, but there's not one, so that's me. So take this cup is going to be one of the things I'm going to put right here, because he's kind of saying that's what he wants, But if not, okay. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again a second time and praying, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again, and he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." Now remember, at the Last Supper, he already said, in kind of code word, that Judas is going to betray him. Well, so you've got, who betrayed? Let's just put Judas on there. We know that Judas betrayed. We've got 30 pieces of silver we'll talk about. And while he was speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. So these are people from the priests and the elders. We're going to see some differences in a little bit about that too. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him, which basically said, "Hail, teacher." And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. So somebody committed some violence there, cut off an ear. So I guess that person could be in trouble. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." You know, we get that phrase, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." This is where it comes from. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled which said that it must happen this way? At that time Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets." Then all the disciples left him and fled. And it says those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following along at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on 2 came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it these men are testifying against you?" So he gets basically said he's going to destroy the temple. In 3 days, he's going to rebuild it. But he said he's going to destroy the temple. So they're going to take that pretty personally. It took them a lot of work to build that thing. I guess we could say it's like domestic terrorism these days, destroying buildings or whatever. They did not, so the high priest stood and said, "Do you not answer? What is it these men are testifying you?" But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That's going to irk them a little bit because he's quoting Scripture. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you." Now, what I am going to tell you, because we're going to look at the other witnesses, but when they hit him and said, "Who is the one who hit you?" he actually was blindfolded, and so that's why they're able to say, "Who hit you?" Because obviously he was looking right at them. They'd be different. Now Peter was sitting outside the courtyard, and a servant girl came and said, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When they'd gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." A little later the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away." And then he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the words which Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that that Jesus had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver. I'm gonna skip a little bit, but basically what happens with that money is it's used to buy a potter's field, which is also a reference back into Old Testament, and that is where that they buried Judas after he hung himself. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. I'm going to put amazed right there. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At the time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. They'd handed Jesus over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask Barabbas and put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And all the people said, "His blood shall be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed them over to be crucified. We're going to get into some details about some of that timing there too. Then the soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. Now the praetorium is basically the military base, the area, but it's also where that Pilate lives, because if your job is to be the quote-unquote secret service for the Roman governor, you're going to basically build your compound around him. And so this was all taking place at the praetorium, and so it's where the barracks and everything were, where all the Roman soldiers were. That's where they were gathered, because their purpose was to protect Pilate. He could move around a little bit, but that was it. There's also a historical thing that I'm going to throw at you, just so it kind of makes sense, but there is archaeological evidence that basically, and I think that we're going to run into another word here in a little bit, but there is the place that in this praetorium they had a cobblestone floor, kind of an area that was cobblestoned. Remember, the Romans built Roman roads out of cobblestones at different times. Well, this place they had taken and had built this area. I don't know if you want to call it a courtyard or something. But they also had a beam, a tree that they had cut and made kind of like a bench. And so that actually, it's called bema, I believe in Greek, but that is where Pilate would have been for this trial. And and we still have terms of you can maybe approach the bench. So it's still, we carry through some of this stuff too. Then the soldiers of the government took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off of him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. And they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. They gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head, they put up the charge against him, which reads, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So that's where I'm going to stop with Matthew. Now we're going on to Mark, and Mark's account that we're going to talk about is Mark 14:43 is where we're going to start. And it says, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him had given him a signal, saying, "Whoever I kiss, he's the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, "Rabbi," and kissed him. They laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, why have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures. And they all left him and fled. A young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony is not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. And so they're back to the domestic terrorism, I guess. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. The high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Some began to spit on him and this is where I talked about Matthew's part, to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and say to him, prophesy. And basically saying, who did this? And officers received him with slaps in the face. As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls, the high priest, came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I neither nor understand what you're talking about. And he went out into the porch. The servant girl saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, this is one of them. But again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are Galilean too. But he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man you're talking about. Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark, before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times, and he began to weep. Early in the morning, the chief priests and the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him. So let's back up. First, he was taken to the religious leaders, and then he was taken to Pilate. Okay, early in the morning, the chief held a consultation. Pilate questioned him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, it is as you say. Okay, so he said, it is as you say. Okay. The chief priest began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him, saying, do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Amazed. Let's put that word down. Now at the feast he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. And so I'm going to skip that for purpose here. But basically they released Barabbas. And then depending on how you look at all this, but at some point they scourged Jesus, which means they beat him. I think probably was the traditional 39 or 40 minus 1, 39 lashes. But then he was handed over to be crucified. And it says the soldiers took him into the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to acclaim him, Hail, King of the Jews. And they kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. So they're mocking him in so many ways. It says, after they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him, because purple, symbol of royalty, but it also would have been expensive cloth. They didn't want to mess that up. And they laid him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, to bear his cross. So they placed him in the place of Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. And they tried to give him wine with his myrrh, and he did not take it. They crucified and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. The description of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. They crucified the 2 robbers with him, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Now we're talking into Luke, and Luke 22:47. While he was still speaking to his disciples, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Jesus, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those who were around him saw what was going on and beginning to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them actually struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus answered and said, stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. So you kind of wonder, Jesus picks up the ear, puts it back on. Now, I think, legally that's another, because we're talking about it kind of like as a trial. Even though, and somewhere in it's my understanding, somewhere in history they think Peter's the one that had the sword. But anyway, whoever cut off the ear no longer could be under charges because there's, no harm, no foul. The ear is good and everything's fine. But otherwise, he could have been in trouble too. So Jesus actually protected him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours. So when did they come to get Jesus? They came to get Jesus at night, right? Okay. Having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. After they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting among them. And a servant girl seeing him, and we're going to go through the whole thing, the rooster, and so we got that. But it says, in this account, the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, before rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. He went and he wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God? Then he said to them, yes, I am. Then they said, what further need do we have of testimony, for we've heard it ourselves from our own mouth? Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you king of the Jews? And he answered and said, it is as you say. It is as you say. He said that now in all 3 different Gospels. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And we learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. He now sent him to Herod. So there's a little more detail in Luke, and I told you he's a historian and probably a little more meticulous. So he went from the religious leaders to Pilate to Herod. Okay. And who himself was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he'd been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Okay. So he goes to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him. It said now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. So at some point in here, basically Jesus gets scourged, gets beat. But they cried out together, saying, away with this man and release for us Barabbas. And he was the one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. So Barabbas really was doing with stuff that Jesus is being accused of. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found him no guilt, demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him." Lost my point. Okay, but they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted, and he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. And then he carries the cross and goes kind of from there. So we've got that. Now we're moving on to the trial parts in John. And like I said, John's a little different. John's going to talk into theology and that sort of stuff. So we're starting in John 18. And when Jesus had spoken these words, he went with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron. There was a garden in which he had entered with his disciples. Now this is kind of like the Kidron Valley is right outside of the old city of Jerusalem, and then the Mount of Olives is up there, and it's got a great view of the city, which is probably one of the reasons that Jesus liked to go up there and pray, because he could overlook what he's praying about. And now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Okay, now the first two have said that his arrest was with, what did I say? We had the people from the scribes, the Pharisees, and now we're getting Pilate's troops. So it looks like we've got everybody involved as far as making the arrest. Okay. So the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, "Who do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said to them, "I'm he." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with him. So when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So in other words, in John's gospel, they cower away. And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. And so if you seek me, let these go their way to fulfill the words which he spoke. Of those whom you have given me, I lost not one." Simon Peter then, now this is where we find out about Peter having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. So now we even know the name of the guy that lost his ear. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put the sword in the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first. Annas? Annas, A-N-N-A-S? And Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. So we're not really doing dirty work with the high priest. We're kind of Annas was the guy who kind of, I think they like to discuss in some of these shows. He does the wet work. He's kind of the heavy who does so he's trying to do it first. So they take him to him. Now Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. In other words, isn't it better for one man to die than to lose the whole country kind of thing? Well, Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. So you kind of wonder, who's this disciple? And I don't really know. In fact, it wasn't until this morning I kind of noticed this detail. But it may have been Judas. Judas may have led him into the court, and they said, okay, this guy comes and goes, and that's okay. I don't know. But then we go through betrayal. And so we know that, you're not one of the disciples. No, I'm not. And everybody's making a fire and whatever. Then the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. So in other words, who's in this insurrection? Who are your disciples? Jesus doesn't rat them out. He doesn't do anything like that. And Jesus answered him, "I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews came together. And I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said." And so he's actually talking about the people right there. Everybody there heard what he said. They've been trying to trap him forever, and they have never been able to do it. And when he said that, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" Now remember, this is Annas first, so it's not really the high priest. Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me?" So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and this is the third rooster crowed. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Passover's coming. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" So in other words, they couldn't enter it, but they've got this kind of, riotous thing going, and so they're like, well, Pilate probably hears that in the morning. Why don't they come in? Oh, it's somebody saying, hey, it's their religious deal. They can't come into the praetorium. And so Pilate meets them kind of at the gate. And so they answered him and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you." We're not wasting your time, Pilate. He's an evildoer. So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." So they upped the ante. This is not about, punishment. This is now we want him killed. Therefore Pilate entered into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" So Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Jesus said to him, "So you are a king." Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "Truth? What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went again to the Jews, who said to them, "I find no guilt in him." He goes basically back to the gate. "But you have a custom that I release someone for you the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the king of the Jews?" And then they went to Barabbas and scourged him and all that other stuff. Now, backing up, like I said, you're all now witnesses of this trial and everything that goes with this. There is actually the word in Greek for witness is martyrios, which is the same word that we get for martyr. So when people die for Jesus, they're dying as witnesses. So you are now a witness of this trial. You're a martyrios. And the one thing that I want to kind of really talk about as an overwhelming theme here, because we're going to kind of walk into some of this. But at any point, did Jesus fight or did Jesus surrender? And we're going to get into that a little bit towards the end, maybe a little bit more depending on how much time I have. But Jesus could have fought. In fact, he even says, "I've got all this power at my disposal," but he doesn't use any of it. So my first note was I said, "Take this cup." So Jesus is struggling with what he knows is coming. He's human. He's fully God. He's fully man, but he's struggling. And so that's why he's praying in the garden, and that's why he's having so much difficulty, because he knows this is about to happen. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be horrendous. And so he really is kind of having in this discussion and saying, isn't there another way? Maybe. So Judas betrays him. Remember Judas went out and took the 30 pieces of silver and pointed him out for him, and they arrested him. And like I said, it's interesting because depending on your account, it was either the religious people or it was the Romans or both. And so, then we had the violence that cut off the ear. Now we have a crime. Somebody has actually shed blood. Okay, that could be a big deal. Well, Jesus fixes that problem. He just takes the ear, sticks it back on the guy. No blood, no foul, no crime. And so when they talk to him, he talks about destroying the temple. I don't think that they fully understood what he was really saying, which I think is kind of fun, because he's kind of doing a little doublespeak to them. He said, you do this and I will destroy the temple, but I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And so they're not understanding that he's speaking in terms of that you're going to crucify him, but he's going to rise on the third day. They're thinking about their actual stone temple, the the incredible place that they have there that has taken them years and years and tons of sweat and blood and everything to build this temple. The stones, I've seen it. The stones there are just huge. You go look online at just the stones of the temple. Many of them are named. I mean, they're just, so this is a place that's just massive. And so for number one, they're kind of discrediting, they're going that, how could anybody destroy this temple? Well, they've actually destroyed 2 temples in the history, so 2 temples have gone away. But they're thinking, that's not going to happen. But why is he saying this? And he's a threat to us. Okay. The other thing I want to throw in there is that in at least 3 of the first accounts, not John's. I said John's got a different reason for writing, but he comes to Pilate, and Pilate says, who are you? Are you this? And he says, it is as you say. And so basically he's using Pilate's own words back at him to say, yeah, that's who I am. Now, I think it's interesting because I think Pilate, and let's first get into some structure here. The structure there for them was that there are at least 3 authorities. One is the religious authorities, and I believe that's the Sanhedrin, but they're the ones that met concerning religious things. The priests, the scribes, they would meet in actually more in the open area, maybe somewhere around the temple, and people would bring religious crimes to them, and they would mete out justice, which may be, we found this guy doing this. Well, then you need to be punished, and you need to donate this much to the church, or you need to make amends this way, or whatever. But they really couldn't put anybody to death. Why? Well, they had these 2 other forms of government. Herod was still the quote-unquote king, although he was a vassal of Rome because Rome had taken over. And at that time, there's a saying that the sun never sets over the Roman Empire. At the time of Jesus' crucifixion, Rome owned it all. Rome was the power of the world. So even though there's this King Herod, he's the one that was in that position. Now, you hear the word Herod, and you're going to think, well, Herod is the one that ordered for all the babies to be killed, and Jesus had to run away to go to Egypt so that he could survive because he was under 2. That was Herod the Great. Herod the Great was an incredibly strong person. I don't know if the Romans, I didn't do that much digging for history, but if memory serves me right, or at least thinking on some things I know about Herod the Great, I don't think the Romans had conquered them yet, and so I think that was something else that changed. Because Herod the Great is the one, if you're in Bethlehem and you look out, there is a hill, a mountain actually, that Herod built. He had people's sweat and blood, and he built this mountain for a palace. He thought, well, there's this kind of plain. I want a mountain there. So when Jesus talks about, your faith of a mustard seed can move mountains, that didn't require faith of mustard seed. That was just somebody who was a tyrant and in charge and could do that. So there's also a temple that was up on a hill that the Romans took over in this place, Masada, is right near the Great Salt Sea. And the Romans built ramps to get up there. So they basically just kept building dirt and moving it until they took them over. They tried to starve them out. They tried to, just do it that way. But Herod the Great was actually somebody to be reckoned with. But this is not Herod the Great. Herod the Great has died. Herod the Great has 3 sons, and one of the sons took over. The 3 sons divided up the kingdom of Israel, and so by doing that, Herod is Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, the way you can kind of remember him, I think, is that they didn't like the Italians, and so Antipas, he didn't like pasta, antipasta. So Herod Antipasta is the one that is actually the one that Jesus had to deal with, one of Herod the Great's sons. He was in charge of that. He is the one that they took him to. And he basically doesn't have the authority to do anything else, I don't think. But then maybe he could have executed Jesus, I don't know. But it says that they took him to that function of the government. And then they take him to Pilate. Now, Pilate, I think, is kind of fun because he's in a really tough position. His job is to keep peace. It doesn't really matter to him what happens to any individual human being. He might have a little bit of trouble if he wiped out Herod, but at the same time, if he's the governor there and Herod's creating problems, he probably could have even executed Herod and had to deal with it. But it'd be a big fight of the people. But like I said, if Rome really he might just do that advisement, but he's strong enough that he could have done that. But so he gets Jesus in front of him. He's like, who is this guy that they're all mad about? And he's a nothing burger. You know, the guy's just barely got on clothes, and he's certainly not powerful, and that they're creating a real stink. This guy doesn't have an army. He's not bringing any kind of real charges. I mean, the only thing they're trying to say is that he's trying to say that he's king. Oh, wait a minute, king. That's bad. He's trying to say king. Well, is he trying to say he's king of the Jews, or he's trying to say in charge of the Romans? He's not really making any accusations about Caesar. And quite frankly, he doesn't even really make any accusations about the Jews. But let's send him to them. Now, the other thing that I find interesting about this trial is Jesus is a man of very few words. You think if you got arrested and you ended up before Pilate and you knew what Pilate could do to you, I think you'd sing like a canary. I think you'd be telling him anything he wanted to hear and trying to do your best to get off, you know. Jesus doesn't do that. And so back to what I talked about, Jesus surrendering, he surrendered to the people in the garden, no problem, surrender, didn't fight. He surrendered to go to talk to Herod, didn't put up anything. He surrendered to Ananias and Caiaphas, didn't really do anything. He surrenders to Pilate. And Pilate is, I think, really kind of freaked out. He's like, wait a minute. You're not like any of the criminals I get in front of me. You know, those people are going to try to point fingers. They're going to try to say I didn't do it. You know, I mean, what's the deal? The prison is full of people who didn't do it. You know, Jesus is not doing any of that. So Pilate's like, wait a minute. I can't find anything wrong with this guy. Nothing in our books that says he deserves anything. And you see, he tried to wash it off once already. He said, I'll take it over to Herod. Now, the problem is he does realize that this guy is creating problems not by anything he's doing, not by anything Jesus is doing. Because, you know, this trumped up charge of he's saying don't pay taxes. Well, remember that. We remember what that discussion was. Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Give unto God that which is his God's. And if so, Pilate hears that, and he's like, he didn't say not to pay taxes. He said, pay all your taxes to Rome. He said, if it's got Caesar's face on it, that's ours. So even the money. So Jesus is off on that. And don't you think Pilate has some spies and some people out there that know and can tell him what's going on? And so he's now like, why is this guy such a big threat? But it also is the fact that Jesus exists is putting a lot of pressure on him because it's creating unrest. And let's face it, the Romans did not like unrest. Yeah, we're going to find the ringleaders and we're going to squish them. Now, the problem he's got is, does he go after Herod? Does he go after the high priests? Or does he go after this Jesus dude? Pretty easy to take care of this Jesus dude because there's just one. But then he even has compassion on him, and he kind of says, look, let's let the people decide. Let's take it beyond the priests and all this other. Let's just get some of this noise cut down, and let's actually let them pick. Now, what's funny is I think he offers somebody to the crowd that Pilate was fine with crucifying. Barabbas was, it says that he was a traitor, and he was, you know, what else did they say about, but they, I don't know. Can't find it, but you have to look. But basically, you know, they know that Barabbas was of insurrection. So he basically says, let you pick. And the scribes and the Pharisees get in the crowd and start yelling and yelling and yelling, and they pick Jesus. And you know that Pilate doesn't agree with that. I mean, he's letting that be a trial. You know, back then we talked about trials and witnesses. You had to have two witnesses. That they have trouble getting two witnesses against him in front of the priests. So Pilate knows they really don't have a case, don't really have witnesses, but they want this. At least that's what he's perceiving. So he washes his hands of the whole thing and says, okay, fine. Crucify Jesus. What is it to me? Once again, Jesus did not fight. He surrendered. He surrendered to the whole thing. And at any point, he could have done something else. Now, I think Pilate is amazed because he didn't try to argue. He didn't try to fight. He didn't try to say, oh, no, not me, or whatever. And he even says, I'm not of this world. Now, how can Pilate deal with a world that's not of this world? And so he doesn't really feel that he's a threat there either. But the other thing I want to point out is, when did they arrest Jesus? Was it during the daytime or was it night? They pick him up at night. So it's even the whole thing, it just stinks. Pilate kind of knows that too. But back to what I kind of get into big things of your witness, and Jesus surrenders. And so we're witnesses, martyrios, to this trial. We're witnesses to Jesus, and Jesus surrenders. And the only thing that Jesus requests of you to be on his team, to go to heaven, kingdom of heaven, as he says, I am the king. All he asks for you is to surrender. You know, we live in a society where everybody likes to talk about fighting. You know, our politicians go to Washington, D.C. to fight for us. When I really wish that they would get together and keep their emotions down and have civil discussions and talk about what their laws are doing to us Americans, and talk about how that our taxes are too high and they keep spending, and there's no reason they need to be spending, and they're spending on a lot of things we don't agree with because they don't really seem to get our input, maybe because somebody else is fighting to have them in office with their money. And so we really end up with, this fighting concept. Lawyers like to say, I'm fighting for your rights. Fight for this, fight for that, fight for whatever. We have all this violence about things that really shouldn't be violent, I'm not saying that our lawmakers couldn't get together and be vocal and have strong emotions, but at the same time, this whole fighting thing is not really that helpful. And so I think it's interesting that Jesus basically didn't fight. He showed us an example. But the example that we also have for Jesus is, if you want to be in heaven, you surrender. You don't keep fighting. You're not going to win against the forces of evil. Only Jesus can do that. So surrender to Jesus and he'll take care of you. And if you look at even some of and I didn't dig through this because I kind of focused on this today, but I kind of think it's interesting, even if you look at battles in the Old Testament, they were won in many ways that didn't involve, there was fighting, yes, but not completely. I mean, with David and Goliath, there's a little boy who surrenders to God and says, I'm on your team, I'll do what you tell me, and slings a rock at Goliath, knocks him down, and cuts his head off. There's a joke about that, why did Jesus cut off Goliath's head? Well, everybody wants to get ahead in life. So surrender. And so I think my topic really here is surrender. Jesus didn't fight. He could have. He could have, just when Satan took him up on the top of the area looking down, he says, jump, because, these angels will get you. And Jesus is like, yeah, I know they would, but that's not the point. So he didn't even fight with Satan. He just kept giving him back everything in the Bible, and Satan just got frustrated. But I think that's it. It's not that we have to do anything. We don't deserve it. We talk about things like gifts. Salvation is a gift from God, but we have to surrender. And I think that if we surrender daily, then we become better martyrios, better witnesses, and we work through our life and realizing, do I fight this or do I surrender? And as long as it's in keeping with what God wants us to do and looking out for others, etc., I think a fight's fine. But fighting for yourself, Jesus didn't fight for himself, and he could have. He could have blown the whole place away. And the thing is that I think Pilate's also looking, does this guy have troops?
He's got 12 disciples. He's got a lot of people. Oh my gosh. Do you think that Pilate didn't know that Jesus fed the 5,000 and all these other things? But did they ever make any moves on Pilate or the Roman Empire? No. And so he knows all this, but he didn't look at Jesus as a threat. And so it's kind of an interesting trial in the way that it all was handled. I'm going to switch gears, back to surrender. Because one of the things that is asked of us as Christians is our tithe. And so we're supposed to surrender a portion of our income of what we have to the church so that the church can do its thing. Because without us surrendering our tithe, the walls don't exist, the air conditioner's not paid, the lights aren't there. We have nothing to work with to be the church. And so that's why we surrender. It's not that somebody comes and takes it from you. It's not a fight for your money. It's a surrender. So if you want to surrender your tithe, we have ways to do that online. And certainly you can come here and donate as well. But that's important. I think that we understand that it's a surrender, and that's why it's a surrender, that we're not going to force you into anything. We're not going to push you. We're not going to give you sob stories. We're not going to do any of that. It's just a duty you have to help kind of further the mission of God. Thank you.